This is not merely a building. It's a sanctuary of remembrance, a threshold where the veil parts, and minds once lulled to sleep begin to rise. This is the house of reawakening minds.
I entered in silence, intellect and despair, seeking refuge from illusions thick in the air. Walls lined with scrolls, lectures dense with light, where knowledge resurrects what was hidden from sight. No pulpit performance, no charismatic show, just a word in its purity, allowing the soul to grow. History unpacked with surgical precision, exposing falsehood, restoring vision. They taught me jurisdiction, the power of a name, how to stand in one's truth, free from legal games, from colonial codes to Moorish descent. I learned that ignorance is the true imprisonment. Not just a church, this is consciousness refined. I found myself inside the house of.
This is sacred ground, not just wood and stone. A haven for the seekers who once felt alone. Here the veil is lifted, the contract unwinds. In the house of reawakening minds. Truth is the altar, wisdom is the flame. Every soul remembered, every bloodline reclaimed. Time collapses and the spirit aligns. Inside the house of reawakening
We
minds.
speak of capitives, diminution, and trust law with grace. Pulling veils from the statues that distort the race. Reverend Doctor don't preach, she teaches through metaphysical keys and universal speeches. From Egypt to Amexim, maps are redrawn, and the minds of the lost are profoundly reborn. They decode etymology, undo the brands, expose how black was a corporate sleight of hand. This is reclamation through language and tone, when status is corrected and sovereigns are grown. From natural law to the astrological signs, the cosmos converge in these sacred confines. This ain't dogma, it's the science of the divine. Every lecture a seed in the garden of the mind.
You said know thyself but gave no guide, until I found the house where illusions died. Here the soul remembers, the contract is clear. We are the heirs and the ancestors cheer. This is sacred ground, not just wood and stone. A haven for the seekers who once felt alone. Here the veil is lifted, the contract unwinds. In the house of reawakening minds. Truth is the altar, wisdom is the flame. Every soul remembered, every bloodline reclaimed. Time collapses and the spirit aligns. Inside the house of reawakening.
They don't ask you to believe, only to remember. You are not lost, you've simply been rendered. Redacted by systems, misclassified by law. But the house restores what the paper man saw. It's not just theology, it's the restitching of fate. The alignment of cosmos with your birthright state. Genealogy meets metaphysics, past meets now. The veil is a lie and this house shows how. They speak a treaty, jurisdiction and name. That being black was never a rightful claim. They restore divine memory through patience and fire. Raising minds from bondage in the conscious empire. No choir needed when the frequency's high. It's the house where illusions die.
House of reawakening minds, where scholars become sages and the forgotten reclaim the eternal.
Happy Holy Day, Moors. Welcome to House of Reawakening Minds. House of Reawakening Minds exists for the exploration and practice of spirituality in an enlightened community dedicated to honoring the myriad of sacred pathways to the universal creator. We are an awakening center for spiritual grounding, free thought, self-discovery, and Moorish science, an awakening experience for all ages. And today, we are discussing something that's pretty much, we will be discussing pretty much on the minds of many. And we want to get right into that discussion. I want to welcome you here. I guess we should bring ourselves online. You think so, Sheik? I'm kind of forgetting to bring us on. But anyway, we about to come. I'm having a brain lapse as to how to bring us on. How y'all doing? How you doing? For just a brief moment, Grand Sheik, I forgot what I was supposed to be doing. Today's been crazy.
Well, basically, because we were talking earlier about how things are, how they say what goes around comes around.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that are taken for granted, even some of the conversations and some of the information in the social forums, particularly in North America, how you say it has come back to bite the people in the political forum. And so battles that they have constructed among themselves in the political forum have brought up very basic issues of the different levels of citizenship that aren't generally discussed among people. But the importance of it is being, how do you say, brought up without being conversed.
Actually, yeah, tonight's broadcast is entitled Drawing a Line in the Birthright Citizenship saying.
Yes.
That's almost like a tongue twister. Really, like you said, it's been on the it's a lot of a topic of discussion. I think I reached out to you the beginning of the week about doing this particular topic because I realized at the time that on Wednesday, the Supreme Court of the United States was going to be hearing, I guess, arguments for or against, or for this, why it should happen, and so forth. And maybe it would be an opportune time.
Things that were taken for granted,
right,
by some, but because of the political atmosphere among the politicians. Remember, not the people, the politicians and their actions that started injuring the people. The issue of birthright citizenship became a topic, not because they wanted it to, but what it shows you, Dr. G, is what is actually pulling out is showing that these things are going to have to be discussed seriously.
Absolutely.
Because they deal with people's lives, their economies, their estates, things that on the surface most people never consider.
Right. And, before we begin, though, let me say this clearly, that everything that we will be discussing tonight is alleged, as we say, and it's our observation and it's our analysis. Now, I want really you to slow down a moment with me. And because what is being presented right now, as I said, in the media, in the courts, and in the public conversation is a debate about birthright citizenship. But what I want to suggest tonight is that this is not just a debate. This is an opening. I mean, sometimes there are opportunities that present themselves, and I feel like this is an opening for long overdue conversation. Not that there has not been anything said, and especially there have been conversations about there's still conversations about reparations and conversations about
and guess what,
various whether or not we're going to lose the right to vote and stuff like that. But this one right here, is one that many may not know the extent to which this issue affects them, of what was done in the past, how they don't, even to this day, they may not know. You who are listening here probably know, because anybody who tunes in to House of Reawakening Minds for more than one or two times has an idea of the chicanery that's going on and has been going on politically, and but there are so many of our friends and our kinfolk and colleagues that just don't really know, and they don't think this affects them because they're like, oh well,
although it does,
right? And but they may say, oh, well, I was born in America, so I'm a citizen of the United States, and that too is something that, and
it's a misstatement. It's actually
right. That's what I'm saying. It is, because people want to embrace the fact that they are a United States
without understanding what they're arguing about. This is what makes it controversial now.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it's an opening, as I was said, that allows us to revisit questions that many people have never been encouraged to ask. Never been encouraged to ask questions about identity
in contemporary times.
Right. And questions about identity, about origin, and about authority, and more importantly, questions about who has the right to define any of those things in the first place.
Mhm.
You know, there's a discussion going on, but who has the right?
So you're talking about the assumption or the assumed jurisdiction of right relative people to people who claim authority by virtue of being constitutional officers, i.e., and having the authority to, under any what you call legal controversy, make those decisions. And so people need to understand where the jurisdictional authority arises, how it arises, because it's being practiced by people who are in positions of political structure who are now being, how do you say, charged with what the office represents, but the actual authority it never vested with them, yet they're trying to exercise it.
Listen, you know, last time I did it. I had a sweatshirt on.
Mhm.
Excuse me. That said allegedly.
Yeah.
So let me sit up a little bit, so you might not be able to see my sweatshirt. My t-shirt. It says, no. So I'm sitting up. So just so you see, no. You don't. And it's time for us to talk about it. It's time for us to talk about that.
You're funny.
Well,
anyway, so, you know, Dr. G, you know, because what's being observed, and it's in this old conversation, but it actually, on another point, it shows you the importance of what Jurali presented to the Aboriginal people here that was being suppressed in order to maintain colonial operations, that many people hearing it kind of took it for granted. But the things that are taking place in the political venues now is bringing that up, although we're not bringing it up. It's among themselves.
Absolutely.
Now, what it is, just like you were saying earlier about the Supreme Court having to address it. Why? Now it's costing. It's costing. See, when things cost, right, both political power and finance, then it comes on the table. And the fact that the Supreme Court is talking about it shows you how serious it is, even if people have been ignoring it or not paying attention.
I'm wondering if they ever considered when they were bringing up this issue about the, this little surface issue about the immigrants, children born of immigrants in the United States, whether the parent was a illegal alien or the father wasn't here or something. Whether they considered that this might open a can of worms, the one we're opening, and some others enlightened are opening to at this point, because you want us to look at this one thing, but we got this whole big thing. Well, go ahead.
In other words, as it becomes a social political problem, they cannot. And this is why it's before the court, honestly, Dr. J, when you analyze it, is because they have to deal with what is called true law, as opposed to what they already know is in the societal structure. They know that the societal structure is moving at this problem connotatively, which was also trained. So the school training, you understand, of the race paradigm and the argument of citizenship relative to the 14th Amendment, as an example, the artificial person, has now come back to haunt them. Now it is structurally and economically causing great problems. And that had to do with actually originated currently from stolen elections and them fighting among each other, the political parties. And so it become of interest to the general public who are hearing these things. Why? Because it has created problems under international law, but it has to be taken in consideration. The problem that the politicians have is that they knowingly, but without it being a public argument, have negated their obligations to international law. The members of the United States Corporation Company who have been governing, who've been violating it in order to maintain colonial powers That's why it's not been publicly discussed. But because it has caused economic and political damage across the states, jurisdictions, and the battles that have come about among them, and it has a lot to do with the financing that they did. So they opened up what they called open up the borders, brought immigrants in, and actually were funding them to be here, but it was done for corrupt political purposes among the political parties. Absolutely. And it become a problem to the masses because it has taken away from the people of the land who were supposed to get the service. But then that venue has been muddied with the black codes. All of those things that they have done with muddying the identities is now what you call backfiring on them politically, although no one's talking about that. This is why, and because it is costly, and the cost hasn't all totally manifested yet, but to the degree that actually different areas of the state's governments in different cities, truthfully, but they haven't talked about it, have gone bankrupt. And so those arguments that are more serious in the different jurisdictions, that's why it's in the Supreme Court, because they have to address it. However, it's not in their interest politically to address it, but it's in their interest to address it because the corporate states are collapsing economically, not just because of other things, but inclusive of the assumed what they call birthright citizens that the middle class, mostly Europeans, have been arguing because it has negatively affected them. That's why, but it was never an argument before because it was only designed to maintain colonial operations to injure the Aboriginal people of the land under the code system. So that meaning that not necessarily for us, but the Supreme Court is addressing it for the corporate states. That's how it came about. No one's making the argument for the people. They're making the argument because city states are like, give you an example, Chicago, because I'm telling you where it has its origin. Chicago is bankrupt, right?
Okay.
Los Angeles, bankrupt. Your major cities are bankrupt. So the people in general are looking at this from one way, but the politicians themselves have to address it because they actually can't move anymore because they're run by the bond system. Remember last week, and a lot of people need to pay attention to how this is connected. The different corporate states, through their representative trustees that are called the congressmen, etc., and then through their mother organization called the United States Corporation Company, this past week, have presented what they always do to refinance the corporate states with what they call bond sales. No takers whatsoever. Now, even though we're not going into it, a lot of people don't understand that this continuous war is a diversion. Concerning that, and you wouldn't, on the surface, you wouldn't make the relationship. And so the argument among state representatives among themselves, not with the public, because remember, they're not making this argument with the public. It originated with them arguing with each other for funding that they're not getting. But they can't sell the bonds, therefore they can't refund the cities, therefore they're actually going bankrupt. And a lot of it has to do with them bringing the immigrants in to use them for votes. And the argument originate with the first time that Trump was running and they stole the election, and it has to do a lot with documents that are coming out that have been suppressed. That yes, the election was stolen, but that ain't even, we're not arguing for or against. That's where it has its origin. So the argument before the Supreme Court is actually among the politicians. They're not putting it in the public venue. We're analyzing it, but they're not putting it before the public venue. Keep that in mind. So this hasn't been a public argument. This is an argument that actually starts among the politicians because the states are actually going bankrupt. And it had to do with them giving them what? I think 2,500 what you call clear credit cards giving them living quarters, free Medicare, and guess what? It's coming home to roost. That's why it's before the Supreme Court, not because of the principles behind it. It's a default action. And then when the United States put up their bonds for sale, because remember, the different nation states were buying with U.S. treasuries.
Right, right.
Remember, I told you years ago, they're going to stop buying U.S. treasury bonds. All of this is related. It wouldn't seem like it by people. This is why they don't teach civics, because people don't make the relationship on how government's jurisdictions are actually funded and represented, or how they're run. So, because remember, so they don't teach civics, so the masses don't, in the general miseducation, the masses don't know that the corporate states are run by selling bonds. And those bonds are put on the world market. And the nations buy the bonds. And that's how they've been funding, far beyond the taxation. And then they would use that as a feedback loop to both rob the people and also fund their wars. So this is bigger than, we're talking citizenship, birthright issue, and drawing the line, but the real deal is bigger than that. But let's keep it simple.
No, but yeah, I agree with you with that. But I get to the point I'm making is that even though this might be the reason they're doing it, they had to know that it was running the risk of having, the sleeping Moors and the awakening Moors to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to step into this discussion because we have some injustice going back hundreds of years that needs to be corrected. And
because it was rooted in what they did. See, this is the point. It was rooted in what they did to us.
Absolutely.
And the maintenance of what you call the color code system and colonial operations on the land of the indigenous people. Politically, what's happening right now with the birthright citizenship argument is not because they're coming ethical or moral. It's because the cities are going broke. They're not presenting the real reason why it's before the Supreme Court. It's because they can't ignore it anymore. It's not because of what it actually means. It's because of the effect of the economics. And it's the bond system. They can't get funding. So they can't, in other words, they can't kick the can down the road anymore. Or they can't, what you say, you know how they used to say, whenever they create these problems, then the term that they use, though, is incorrect, is throw money at it. And they're used to them doing that generation after generation. And most of people, although they may say it, don't accept the reality that they ran out of road. That's really what's happening right now. And they're looking at one thing, but the one thing is a cover for what's really happening. And it's really an effect of the bond system breaking. In other words, the relationship, even though we're not going into that part of it, I'm telling you that's why it's for the court, because it means it's gotten that bad. Remember, when it gets to the Supreme Court, it's really bad.
Right.
However.
So they're looking for an out. They're looking for an out.
But they can't get out.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, like this. The 14th Amendment artificial construct and its operations Intl fabric has served its purpose to suppress the people, but the side effect is it has come to terms whereas now it has caused economic problems for them. Though it's related to that, they're not going to discuss that publicly. They're going to present it to the public as if it's the moral argument relative to who's a citizen, who's not, what makes a citizen, what does not, who has the authority to claim who's who. And guess what? It's muddy. You know why it's muddy? Because they haven't taught civics. Now you see the point? It's coming back to haunt them. So the argument is becoming public because the cities are going broke. But the knowledge necessary for the people to support the argument one way or another, the people in general are suffering ignorantia. And ignorantia is the law term meaning that the people don't know the law. And where they say ignorance of the law is no excuse.
That's right.
It's hitting now. And it has to do with the law of identity, because you got to, in other words, it's who's who. But when they opened them borders, they weren't doing that for that purpose. They were doing it for political corruption between the cottonwigs and the conscience wigs, who hide themselves in the general public venue as Republicans and Democrats. In other words, their corruption has clashed and actually created economic problems for themselves, which is tied to the bond system, which is used to fund the cities and the states, which the nations aren't buying. And this birthright citizenship argument is simply a residual part of the result of that corruption, but they're not going to make the tie. I just made the tie.
Yeah.
As a point of fact.
Yeah, no,
and that ain't allegedly.
With regard to the bond system, you know, I experienced that when I was a housing director for Wilmington, and every other year, I believe it was, we had to actually go to the bond market, and we had to put in the various projects that we were proposing because the city was going to the bond market. And so, you know, I don't know what these cities are doing. Like you said, now many are going bankrupt, but they can say it's a hole that they dug for themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
and the birthright citizenship argument comes from the middle class Europeans who are arguing about these last few years where they've been giving immigrants, you know, these checks and free housing, free medical care, and credit cards, i.e., and they started off with $2,500 or something like that. Right. And food. And so the people who in their mind, in their training, called themselves U.S. citizens, felt cheated because they were suffering, losing jobs and losing houses while immigrants. And so now the politicians were starting to use the people to fight against the immigrants as if the immigrants were doing it. And the immigrants is just as much victim as the people, if you get the point.
Right.
In other words, they're not looking at it this way. They're just looking at the things that occur in the political forum of the U.S. corporation going into other parts of the world, robbing them, causing people to have to come here, i.e. because they were being poor in their own jurisdictions because they were being robbed by colonial operations. And this is the argument that you see going on right now with them going into Venezuela as an example, right? How they've been blockading Cuba for 60 some odd years, right? And so a lot of people that came to the North came not because they didn't have resources home, is that the people that govern here use their army of the Circle Church and Chancery to go rob the people around the world. This is what they call the Unum Sanctum Wars, or they call the never-ending war operations. So the real deal is the effects of the real politics that is not talked about publicly are coming home to roost. A lot of these things are going to have to be analyzed by the people that are going to be injured, but on the surface, they're arguing immigration. But that's the surface. That's an effect. You know how they say you got a headache, but they're not talking about cancer. If you get political cancer, now, and we're not going there. But what as soon as when you started the conversation, I recognized what was happening. It immediately, because it was only a matter of time. Now, as things go, a lot more is going to come out. But yet, in order for them to make the argument, now they've got to really honestly, although they're going to resist making it public, talk about the 1870 Naturalization Act and the Horace Greeley operations in Philadelphia 54 that we've been telling people, because that's the politics, whether they like it or not. And it's sort of like people don't understand the things they're suffering now are things that were set into action earlier. Just like the 14th Amendment being unconstitutional, knowing that it's unconstitutional, but yet it has served its political purpose for their operations against Aboriginal people. It is now collapsing, but It's affecting them. That's why it's before the Supreme Court. I'm telling you, cause and effect. Although, you know, you can analyze that, but it's obvious. It is absolutely, I mean, on the surface, anybody that knows geopolitics see it immediately, right? Mm-hmm. And so what they're doing, they want the people to argue among each other or blame the people who are immigrants when they're both pawns. And to tell the truth, they've got to admit that the corruption of the 14th Amendment. Another thing that would appear on the surface to be disconnected, but it absolutely is connected. They would, so in order, right? So with that, you know, that concept, the truth of what's behind being observed is we must re-examine the definitions in order to comprehend what's being talked about, because people say identity, but politically or lawfully identity has not been expressed, right? And because definitions are not neutral. And people, remember, in connotative linguistics, people take things to mean whatever the political venue says they mean, but that ain't what it is. So they're constructed within systems of governance. And of course, that system is what is called the 14th Amendment construct in the minds of the people, what they refer to as U.S. citizenship. So citizenship, nationality, and status are all terms that carry meanings based on the political jurisdictions, the authority of the jurisdiction, the exercise of jurisdiction, the in personam dealing with the people themselves, the subject matter, that means the classification of the operations of law, and territorial jurisdiction, which means the land. And then jurisdiction is the power to act on them, which is who has the authority to make the claim. In other words, they politically painted themselves into a corner. They're not going to bring that up. That's why you did.
Yeah.
Right. So jurisdiction determines who is recognized under what you call constitutional systems and who are not. So now that's what is called the Naturalization Act. So now that means that has to be brought into the public venue, doesn't it? And it hasn't been taught in school, has it? So now they got a conundrum, right? And under what conditions? Because now you got to make clear determinations. You can't be vague. That's why it's before the courts. So when people speak of birthright citizenship, they're speaking of recognition under a legal framework. Now, so they got to identify what that legal framework is. You see? But recognition and origin are not the same thing. That means it must be made, the distinction must be made, and must be made lawfully.
Right. And that distinction is where the doorway opens, y'all, because most people aren't making that distinction.
Yeah.
They're hearing citizenship and thinking, like you said, identity. They're hearing birthright and thinking something natural and something inherent, something unquestionable. But what we are looking at is something that has been defined, and that's right. And it's been interpreted and it's been applied, more of, and by systems. That's the point. Systems, you have to understand systems that existed long after the people themselves.
Now, for social control systems, right? For suppressing the Aboriginal people, right? The original 13th Amendment, that's rooted in Constitution and treaty principle, right? Was actually, and it's referred to as a nobility clause, right? But they don't teach that, right? And so they use it as a cover under the guise of abolishing slavery, when actually they were reinforcing it. That's what the 14th Amendment is. That's why it's called negative law for those who know jurisprudence. You know, and then when you go into congressional records, you see that the 14th Amendment, 14th Amendment is unconstitutional. But they will never make that argument to the public. Why? Because it maintained the social controls, right? So that
well, even though, like you said, it wasn't ratified, right?
Which means it's not law, never was.
But to keep a semblance of or facade that it is, and then to subjugate people as a result of
that's
that.
Called color of law.
But it also sounds like a major crime
Of course it is. It's called a crime against humanity. Now you understand why the owners of the United States Corporation Company, and an argument that's maybe in the world right now, is that they are charged with what? Not acknowledging or recognizing international law. Why? Because international law holds them to the Constitution that they are claiming their office on, but they're actually in violation of, in order to maintain administrative color of office, administrative color of jurisdiction, administrative color of authority, and color of law. Now, logically, they're not going to present that argument before the people. Why? Because it becomes obvious that they're operating in misprision of treason. See, so it allows for them to control and to continue to control under colorable conditions without the masses knowing that they're operating under color. And so they created the 14th Amendment that establishes, i.e., their corporate citizenship, but it's really not national citizenship. This is where you get the issue of what is known as jus sanguinis, distinguished from jus soli. And this is the argument that comes about with the Whigmore Party operations in Philadelphia 54, etc., and the issue of free white persons as described when they modified in 1870 the Naturalization Act, because this whole subject of so-called birthright citizenship is rooted in the Naturalization Act. That's why it's not taught, because it's a can of not worms, it's a can of snakes to the politicians.
Okay.
However, to educate the people, they would have to publicly back up everything Drew Ali said in 1913. Because you got to make that distinction. In other words, that's what the pressure is. That's what they're avoiding.
Mm-hmm.
And if one doesn't know basic civics, jurisdiction, you understand what qualifies as citizenship and what does not, right? They would take that as just an emotional approach when actually it's a law approach. And it's something that have to be answered. So what? They're going to have to answer who's who. Who are the people of the land by pedigree? Because that's where the birthright is. And then those who are jus soli, that means politically addressed citizenship, which would be 14th Amendment. And in law, those under that are not valid. In other words, they don't have right to the resources. Now you see what's happening around the world where the nations are nationalizing their resources. Yeah. That's what it is. They're being forced, in order to save the political jurisdictions, they have to identify who's who. And politically, they're trying to walk and talk around it and make it complex when it really isn't. However, the corruption of both identity and citizenship has been the taught norm. And so you have an ignorantia among the public, and yet they have to appeal to the public for support of the politicians who are really the corruptors of it. And it's coming home to roost. Therefore, it must go before the Supreme Court. Why? Because they have to talk what it actually is in order to make that determination. Because it's called what's called litigation. So what is litigation? You take the aggregate subject, right? And you remove the falsehood from mixed arguments, remove the falsehood and leave the truth. They're dancing at the political prom, and it ain't fun. Anyway, so it introduces a classification and the different classifications. One that defines who is recognized as a citizen within that system. So you got to end. Now you're dealing with political jurisdictions, right? That contain both people just soleil and people just sanguinis. But remember, they haven't been teaching the people about nationality because they've been suppressing it. However, it's destroying the economic system. It's the only reason why it's a subject before them, right? So the 15th Amendment, they created the 15th Amendment to address the voting rights, to imply the people's right of claim of people who are representing, controlling the estates. That means the wealth of the people, right? Because that's what it is. That's what is implied. Because remember, political positions are a trusteeship. That's why people need to know that, what it actually is. And guess what? By law, they're all invalid, but yet they're so holding them seats. See the corruption? See what's really behind this thing that no one's talking about? And so the history shows that access to those rights, etc., has been limited through various mechanisms. And the mechanisms have been what? The Black Codes, Negro Act, the Trading with the Enemy Act, the Tax Act, the establishment of the Federal Reserve. All of these things, unconstitutional, were put in place to actually steal the birthright. But on the surface, people who don't know the politics thought these were legitimate institutions. None of them are. So those amendments, that's right. That's why they refer to them as the three badges of fictional law. In legal terms, they refer to them as that. Right? Yes. And so these amendments did not remove the system. Right? They actually support the system, but the system is the construct, the artificial construct for what? Human trafficking that no one's talking about, right? So they adjusted its operation.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's where we need to slow this down, because when something is adjusted, it means something was already in place. Yes.
And so they had to modify.
And when something is granted, it means that it was either withheld or redefined before that moment. So we can't look at these amendments as the beginning of identity. We can't do that. We have to look at them as responses, I would assume, to something that had already occurred.
To social engineering problems.
Right. And that forces us to go back further. It actually forces us to go back further. And I know you can do that, with your historical knowledge. But brings to mind,
but the real
how did we get there? How did we get to the point where another people from another land or jurisdiction,
from another jurisdiction?
Because
remember, jurisdiction don't always mean distance.
Right. So from another jurisdiction had the ability to define an existing people. I mean, how did we get there? Yes,
it's called colonial operations. See, and it's back to a conversation that me and my brother was actually having yesterday. And this is the problem with the people here with discussing any of these problems, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not thinking that the political operatives that are running what they call the government, the U.S. government, are actually members of secret societies. And why do they belong to secret societies? It is so that they can stay focused on the real mission of the doctrine of discovery, from which they're claiming their authority, but it is not to be known by the general populace who are being governed. Do you understand? And no one's going to talk on that level, though we are, right? And so the doctrine of discovery established the principle of operations of the foreign Europeans operating at North America and at South America. Now you understand where the controversies are coming forth right now in the political arena, where they're arguing about Trump going into Venezuela and literally taking the president of Venezuela. So now you're dealing with what they call the doctrine of discovery, but it comes under another name. What is that name that they use for for operating their claim on the West. That's for the people, because we want them to start thinking. Anyway, so the Europeans' powers, which is a jurisdiction, to claim lands inhabited by non-Cretan peoples, right? And you understand, they do their politics under the name Christians, although they're Cretans, right? And so this, under that, is the declaration of authority. So that the declaration of their authority is unum sanctum, and dum diversas, Romanus Pontifex, inter caetera divina, collectively known commonly as discovery. And then it's really the doctrine of discovery. Yet they're ancient bullas, but they operate today. The masses are not supposed to know that. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment are supporting the system. You know how people say the system?
Mm-hmm.
But you ask them to name the system, and then they start talking race and things, because that's the training. The system is doctrine of discovery, right? And so this was this is the basis of their authority. Colonial powers. That's why in law, not in opinion, it's called de facto. That means they're a substitute. But the people are not to know that. And so, and at once the declaration was made, the systems of law were constructed to support that system. That's why they're contrary to Constitution. Once you examine them, it's contradictory to the Constitution for the United States. So to hide their operations, they present in their public argument Constitution of the United States that makes it not the document, but sounds like the document. So the subtlety, even in the language, is part of what? Creating the artificial system, right? So the systems of law and government was built upon that, you see? And so those systems included the classifications, i.e. mostly misclassifications of the peoples of the land who were already on the land. This is where they call the Carlos Linnaeus phenotype operation 1795 and the Blumenbach operations for the phenotype, from which they designed what they call schism operations among the people in order to create what is commonly used today for social controls called the race paradigm. So you got to know the origin of these things. So to fix that, they have to deal with what? Nationalization. Why? Because the operations of the doctrine of discovery is denationalization. So they denationalize the people to claim the land, but the problems of the denationalization is affecting more people than it was supposed to be. That's why. So then I guarantee you, the minutes of the Supreme Court is not going to be made public. I'm telling you, they're not.
Well, you know, and if you really sit with that, you begin to see that identity as we know it today, you know, has been filtered through systems that were never neutral.
They
were constructed, imposed,
but not taken serious.
Yeah, and they were maintained. So when we talk about who is American, we can't ignore the processes that shape that definition. We just can't. You know, and you know, we talked about this earlier today when, you know, about the 1828 Webster's Dictionary defined American as the original.
Defined American.
Let me just read it to be. Yeah. Let me be specific. So let me just read it from.
So you deal on 1828.
1828. America.
America, then American.
Okay, we're gonna do both. What is America and what is American? Florentine. Okay, one of the great continents first discovered, it says, by Sebastian Cabot, June 11th, OS 1498, and by Columbus or Cristobal Colon, August 1st, the same year. It extends from the 80th degree of north to 54th degree of south latitude, and from the 35th to 156th degree of longitude west from Greenwich being about 1,000 miles in length, Its breadth at Darien is narrowed to about 45 miles, but at the northern extremity is nearly 4,000 miles from Darien.
Now that is called in law territorial jurisdiction.
Okay.
All right. Now, so that's geography. Now continue.
Okay. From Darien to the north, the continent is called North America, and to the south is called South America.
Yes.
So American.
Now you're talking in personam jurisdiction. Now you're talking about the people, you see?
Mm-hmm.
So now we're explaining jurisdiction, you see? Continue.
It says there's two definitions. One, pertaining to America, a noun, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans.
Now that's American.
Yeah,
but
that's that
modification.
Yes,
But now, which means political modification. Now you're dealing with the Naturalization Act 1854. You see, now you understand the Whittemore Operations Philadelphia. Now you understand free white persons, Horace Greeley, and then when they started, why? What was that meeting about? For them to steal the land, they started calling themselves free white people. It was a political act, not complexion, status. You continue.
But now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America.
Now you're talking just Soleil. Now you're talking the Naturalization Act. You see? Now, so that's what's before the Supreme Court. They got to make that distinction lawfully. Why? Because it's corrupting the economic system and no one's funding it anymore. So they can't hide it. See, as long as they could fund the bond, that's the bondage. That's the bondage, not a chain. They're sale contracts of human trafficking. It's how they've been funding the corporate states. The corporate states, not the land. It's now in conflict. You see, Dr. G?
Yeah, so when we look at, though, that definition, what was in the originally in this dictionary, what it tells us is that the term originally referred to the people who were already here. Yes. So now we have to ask.
We're talking occupation. You're talking colonial occupation. Not from an emotional or loose perspective, but from a right of claim perspective.
So yeah. So now we have to ask, how did that definition change? And how did the original Americans become something else, and while others became the default Americans?
So now you got to talk about this what we talked about before, Dr. J. Now that the political conversation must really honestly be had, and this is what have we said over the years. In order to really understand the social engineering problem here at North America, that's going to have to be addressed. It was only a matter of time. They have to know about the Whittemore Convention, 1854, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, because that's where the modifications were made that we're suffering from now. You see the point? And people who don't know that, one, wouldn't know to look to that to solve it because they don't know that's where the origin. In other words, you know how you say to fix something, you got to understand where it was broke, who broke it, and how they broke it. But what has happened with the masses, they keep arguing the symptoms, how they feel, how somebody's treating them, whether they like them or not, what color is their skin, all symptom diversions. The issue is the Naturalization Act, because they're going to have to what? Identify who's citizens of the land and citizens of the corporation. One is a birthright. The other is conditional, which means it can be removed. It's called jus soli. That which can't be removed is called jus sanguinis, i.e. pedigree. So now, when you looked at the book, right? So the first definition is the pedigree. The second is jus soli. So if you don't teach people civics, they can't tell the jurisdiction. They think it's one. And so people have been assuming that just because they are what you say here in North America, it makes them, i.e., a citizen. Not true. They allowed it to appear true while they were using these people for pawns to vote and other things. Now that is breaking the system economically, they want to argue, don't they? Why? Because middle class has been sacrificed to maintain it, and they ain't having it. Now, what I just said, you know, and I know that's not in the minds of most people when they're looking at this issue. So that change occurred through processes of governance, colonization, and thus redefinitions, or what you call connotative linguistics is the redefinitions. Why? Because things are what they are. So you look at the first part of that, and you're dealing with the definition. The second part is redefinitions, right? So these terms evolve over the years, and they're based on how they're socially applied, mainly by those who are governing or administrating government. And these definitions often shift according to the political agenda. You see the point?
Yeah.
But it doesn't make them lawful or right, you see? So over the years, that created the political vagaries, doesn't it? Now, again, that's why it's before the Supreme Court now. And I suspect that they're not going to be honest to the general public. That's why I say, if anybody, they should be looking at the minutes, which probably, you know, and this is, again, why they hide things. You know what I mean?
When you were talking, it made me think of the shirt that we sold a few years ago.
Yeah, and what does sanguine? Sanguine means blood.
That shirt said, it said
the blood.
It says, what did it say?
Yeah. The blood don't lie.
People
do. Know your birthright.
Your blood.
Just sanguinous. Exactly.
This is a t-shirt I designed.
Now, so this is described in the first part of the Americans, the copper complexion people. That's this.
Yeah.
Now, the second part, it now means Europe. That's 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
See now, and this is back to people, how they can expose information, but people, if they don't know what they're reading, meaning if they don't know that the classifications of citizenship is just sanguinis and just soleil. So if they don't know that in the Naturalization Act, the politician can present any kind of argument among them, and it's usually emotional based, isn't it? That has come home to roost. All right. So that change occurred through the processes that they created for their governance under color and under color jurisdiction. What is the color jurisdiction? They've been operating under 14th Amendment. You see? So, which is really colonization, right? But the people, not knowing it's unconstitutional, don't know that it doesn't apply to the land or the people of the land. So they have to trick the people of the land to accept it in order to make the claim. That's the 14th Amendment issue. So these terms evolve based on how they are applied. And these are those adjustments that you talked about. And when that alleged authority shifts for those controlled purposes, the definitions also often shift with it, right?
Yeah.
By political necessity, not by truth, not by law, but by legal process. That's a distinction, right? And so what we see today is not necessarily the original meaning or meanings of these terms, words, phrases, and classifications. See, but is modern administrative applications, and those applications were created by political, i.e., necessity, not by truth of law.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So now, can we take this a little step further? Yeah, because regardless of what the Supreme Court decides, this entire conversation opens, like I said in the beginning, a much wider discussion, and it opens the question of who actually has
who.
Yeah, well,
that's who's who.
Who has the birthright to this land?
Who's the true? Let's put it clear. Let's make it clear.
Yeah, who actually has the birthright to this land? And from my perspective, the copper-colored, melanated Aboriginal people of this land.
No, original means the truth.
Right, are the ones with the true birthright claim.
All right.
And what we're seeing today is a debate happening within a system that may have already redefined who the original people are. Well, not may, they did.
Well,
right?
That's why they did it.
Right, because many of us have been taught that our story begins with slavery, and that we came here, that we are not from here. And I'm saying that we need to re-examine that. We really do. We really need to.
Which what now? So now remember, they, in order to examine it, we've got to get away from emotions and deal with law and jurisprudence. Because that's where it's rooted. Because that's where the determination is. That's the aggregate.
It is not rooted in fact.
Now, so that those perspectives.
Look, is it not rooted in fact and truth? What's true?
That's why it's before the courts.
Yeah.
Right. So those perspectives that we discussed and that other people may be discussing, right? And because remember, the motive of the discussions vary. One, because of the reclamation of birthright for nationalization purposes. The others to maintain color of authority constructs that are in place de facto. See, so they're protecting their corruption. Now, because of identity, history, and classifications, and the misclassifications, it creates the complex subject matters concerning the statuses of the people. And so there are indigenous populations, right?
Yeah.
That because of reconstructed history, many of them lost consciousness of their connection to the land and thus the estates. And then others who have been brought here under colonial operations are making a claim on the land and the estates that don't belong to them. So that's the complex issues that it creates, you see. So there were indigenous populations on the land at North, Central, South America that are the people of the land. And there were people that came or were brought. Very few were brought. Most people came here through what you call migrations and trade.
Right.
But mostly the alleged authorities were under colonial powers. But the colonial powers are de facto fiat. That's why when they look at the bullets, they always refer to them as fiat, including their trade principles are called fiat. So if the people don't know the language, they don't know that the fiat is fraud at its base. So you have people claiming on the state that is not theirs and making claims against those who have right of a state who have been suppressed, whose both history and claim of land have been suppressed, right? So there are also processes of those reclassifications and the renaming, but the renaming was for what? To steal in the estates. And so rather than accepting a single narrative, because the complexity is that all these things must be discussed. But the subject matter, the subject matter by law, not by opinion, that must be addressed is the Naturalization Act and the contamination of the Naturalization Act 1870. Because that's where it took place. In other words, you got to study that to fix it. And I guarantee you that's being discussed in the Supreme Court, but they ain't going to discuss it publicly. So rather than accepting a single narrative, it becomes important to examine how these categories and misclassifications were formulated. Again, how were they formulated? Now you got to go Whittemore Party Convention, Philadelphia. So they got to talk about things that haven't been taught in school. They got to talk about things that are been inculcated within the social structures administratively without the general public knowledge, and has created the social economic problems that we have today that have ran their course and crashed, and is making the corporate states bankrupt, and the nations won't buy their bonds anymore. And the resources they've been giving to immigrants, and then having the people argue with the immigrants as if the immigrants did it when the politicians did it.
That's right. And when we look at systems like the Dawes Rolls, we see that, again, identity itself became something that could be documented and assigned.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So, and once identity becomes administrative,
yes,
it also becomes something that can be altered. And that's what we're dealing with.
That's what the 14th now. So the 14th Amendment serves what you just said. That's the administration. That's why they had to create color of law subdivisional information to support the corruption while not telling the people that it's corrupt. So yes, and that shows how color governments distinguish from legit. How do you tell? So the people are going to have to do what? Before the people. How do you distinguish legitimate government from de facto government? It's going to have to be addressed. Why? Because these misclassifications that has created these problems with the Naturalization Act modifications, and I'm giving you the year 1870, starting at Philadelphia, right, have now come home to roost. And so now they're being forced, although they're not going to make it immediately public, to define the identities of the true people through the records that they haven't burned. But some of the records are there. This is why when you see where some of these things that were discussed, when you see those proclamations, like in Chicago and those proclamations, they say that these people are Moors, but they still, at the same time, try to word it in such a way as if the people came here without saying that, when the real deal, they're the people of the land. Which brings us back to the core issues, right? Who defines identity? By what authority do they act? By what authority do they claim? By what authority do they exercise authority to make the claim? You see? And so by what authority? And that authority is called jurisdiction, right? And so what is happening now in the political forum, in the social structures, particularly of North America, and it's affecting the rest of the world, right? It's an opportunity for deeper examinations of these subject matters. But the people need to know what they're studying in order to study the subject matter. In other words, you got to get on subject to study the subject. And the subject is called Nationalization and Naturalization Act. That's where it's rooted, right? And so when definitions are challenged, because they are being challenged, why it's before the courts, people are forced to question and to examine the questions. What they previously accepted, whether their valid concepts are valid or not.
Right.
Whether the administrative laws built around those concepts are valid or are not. When it didn't cost them, they could get away with it. Now it's costing them because the bond system is broken.
Right. And that's where responsibility comes in, because we can't afford to just react to everything that happened and what's happening. We have to become more aware, more informed, and more intentional. And you know what pains me a lot when I think about things like that is the number of people, particularly my kin folks, grateful for the ones that are the few that are awake, but that don't know and don't know that they don't know. They don't want to know. They don't know that they don't know what they don't know. And the very thing that they are.
But it's affecting them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And by not knowing, the politicians can, would you say, control the narrative, which is what they've been doing, and diverting the people to emotional arguments and getting the people to what? Get mad at the immigrants when the immigrants are only pawns in political corruption. That must be known. So don't fall for them getting the people fighting each other. So you must understand the structure, but you got to know what the structure is to understand it. So the structure that's before the court is what? Hidden issues, controversies, statements, things done, finance moved under maintaining the 14th Amendment artificial law that was put in place to support the corruption that took place in Philadelphia under the Whigmore Party in 1854 with the modifications of the Naturalization Act. So understanding that structure allows for aggregate discernment and clarity.
Wow. I want to, I've been looking at the comments and I wanted to, maybe we could address some of the comments that I'm going through. Some are so
logically it's going to bring, it's going to, like we were saying earlier, it's going to bring it, because when you get into it, why? We've got to get away from emotion and actually get to the law and get to definitions.
Right.
Right. And you already know it's an old argument, but it's one that has been avoided, if you get the point. But you know why it's been avoided. But because the bond system is broken, they can't avoid it anymore. That's why it's before the courts, because they certainly ain't going to present it to the public.
Right. I'm looking at, I'm clicking on some of them so I can pull them up. Yeah, I see quite a few comments about the shirt that I designed.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get that reprint. Y'all we need to
turn around.
It has Dr. G. It says the blood don't lie. People
How many years ago? That's about 2 years ago.
No, it's more than 2 years ago. Wow. This is
time flies.
I mean, we actually have a raffle this one off. This is a 2X. Mm-hmm. This is it's new. It's never worn, but it's just that we had them we had them at
come to think of.
We had them at a conference. Remember, I designed that.
Yeah. Have them.
I'll go back to the brother to see if he could.
Have them send a donation for it and just mail it to whoever wins it.
Yeah.
It's just for fun. That they can have it.
Great. This is a 2X, y'all. This is a 2X.
You can use it. What if you're smaller, you can use it as a sleeper.
A sleep shirt. Yeah. Right. But so we should raffle this off.
Yeah.
Some funds for the House of Real Awakening Mind, but also we'll look into maybe getting them reprinted.
Yeah.
The brother that did them for me is in Florida territory. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but anyway, let me see.
Land of Flowers.
Okay. See if I can get here. Take your ticket. Let me see if we can get to some of your. If you all have specific questions, let me go over here to what I started already. So
now see.
Here's
she talked about the Monroe doctrines. You see,
where was that?
That's what they're using.
Was that? Let me go back to live. You saw that.
The Monroe doctrine is what they're using to make the claims. That's why they went and got Maduro. So see, and this is back to people need to understand the system that they're actually arguing that's not being made public. All of it's coming home to roost.
The Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, they're making a claim of the Western. See, this is what's happening. This is the real politics, you all.
Y'all, let me look it up.
Most of you all know. But what's really making it difficult for them, right, is that the nations are addressing it more or less realistically, and the people here are not really being apprised of the real political venues. Why? Because we're under occupation, and they have a narrative for the people under occupation, and then a narrative for the rest of the world. That creates the complexities and the contradictions that the people keep noticing when they're looking at the politicians argue among themselves, particularly with the ongoing wars, as an example, the wars that are going on currently, which are just simply extensions of the old wars.
And you said a never-ending war, you called it, right?
Yes, that's what the never-ending wars are about.
One war after another, huh?
Because they're maintaining colonial occupation.
Let me share. Okay, I got some information on what the Monroe Doctrine is, because I didn't know myself, y'all. Yeah. So the Monroe Doctrine was a U.S. foreign policy announced in 1823 by President James Monroe, and it says in simple terms, it said European countries should not colonize or interfere in the Americas, North America or South America.
No.
If they did, the United States would see it as a hostile act. Well, isn't that special?
In other words, now keep in mind,
we're the only ones to colonize.
What is the doctrine of discovery agreements among the Europeans?
Okay.
They divide political operations between the Western Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. What's operative today for people who really don't understand the politics to cut through the chase, the Khazarian Mafia is really the hybrid Europeans whose mission under the doctrine of discovery is to control the Eastern Hemisphere, is now called Israel. And those who to control the Western Hemisphere is called United States Corporation Company, pretending to be the country, which is what you see going on. And if people
fighting each other, it's infighting, y'all.
now you understand why the people don't understand the politics and why they're looking at Trump constantly in constant contradiction, because they're operating on the Monroe Doctrine at all times, but they're not making it public. Now you understand why they went and got Maduro?
Okay. No, I still don't.
Because the colonial operations of North and the South, not just North America.
Okay. So in return,
now you understand why they don't want to acknowledge what? International law, rights of indigenous people. You see the point? Theft of the birthright, jurisdiction.
Well,
what gave them the authority to go and do that? What gives them the authority to what? Blockade Cuba for 65
first of
years.
All, Sheik, the doctrine was created by the U.S. if you will, of
now that answers your earlier. Don't that answer your earlier question?
So they created it, the U.S.
So it's de facto, isn't it?
Right, it was de facto when it was created.
Now it may be legal, but it ain't lawful. Now you see jurisprudence. Are we talking jurisprudence, Dr. G?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so you see why they don't teach geopolitics? Because it exposes
what made it legal, because they said it.
But it ain't lawful.
Right.
Now you understand why the 14th and 15th Amendment, 14th, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was put in place.
So I asked this question.
Color of law.
Right. So I said, is it lawful? And it says what the Monroe Doctrine actually is. The Monroe Doctrine is not a law.
It's doctrine of discovery.
It is a policy statement.
It's what is the policy? Doctrine of discovery. Yeah. In other words, we're being specific, Dr. G. See, in other words, this is the real issue. The people can't really address the problem honestly as long as they keep dealing with it emotionally. They're going to have to deal with the real geopolitics, which means they're going to have to deal with the facts on what created the problem to fix the problem. So the problem is the Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine of discovery, unum sanctum, which is really being exercised, veiled under the 14th Amendment. Artificial person, artificial law, artificial jurisdiction.
But if a doctrine is not law, so
that's their claim.
Neither is the doctrine of discovery.
See, but there you get now. So until the indigenous people understand what they're actually operating on, the indigenous people allow them to control the narrative and make them think it's something else. This is why they don't teach geopolitics. Isn't it an old argument? Again, what is going on now?
Well, first of all, we see that the Monroe Doctrine was not agreed upon by other foreign
operative.
nations. But the other nations didn't agree on it. You know,
of course they did.
And it was a United States unilateral declaration.
Now,
but not,
all right. Now here we go again. Now you understand what Traore and others are arguing today. It's an old argument that people think because it's a new time, it's a different operation because they're using different political phrases. Mm-hmm. And this is the connotative distinguished from denotative. So when you read American, right, the original means what? Denotation, the truth. The second part of the statement is what? A layer. It's layered. Mm-hmm. Colonial operations. See, but people on the surface of their mind are not thinking colonial operations, are they? They're thinking opinion on definition. You see the point? Mm-hmm. So in order to understand what was done, now you understand the argument for the Naturalization Act and show you how this stuff gets you right back to the law, right? Now look at this, Dr. G, and it's the same thing. And notice how it goes full circle. You know, I say what comes around goes around. What goes around comes around, and it comes what is called full circle, right? Law. So now we're dealing with law, right? There's the law. There you go again, and it ain't been discussed. There it is. And when did they modify it? 1870. What is it? The Naturalization Act. What does the Naturalization Act deal with? It deals with aliens. It's the classification, the law classification for alien citizenship conditions, whether it's green cards, visiting, school, scientific. The ninth is usually around 19 classifications of the conditions of people being here. When they open the borders, as they say, right? And without, you understand, Naturalization Act being enforced, it's illegal. However, 90% of them people that cross the border are Americans. See how they muddy the water?
Mm-hmm.
But there are other political jurisdictions. Guess what? It has to be what? Lawfully discussed, because it has what? Created unmitigated and destructive economic problems that cannot be hidden. The different major states of what they're calling, they gave a name for the states that they call politically. It's created bankruptcy that they can't hide. And then when they went to sell bonds to the rest of the world to cover their debt, no one was buying it. And I think the other day, Japan, which is a vassal state of the corporation, right, dumped U.S. Treasury bonds because their yen is dead. So these things
their fiat
are connected, and you're dealing with a civic problem that is destructive, and you have the greater mass of the people that don't know basic geopolitical civic jurisdiction knowledge, and it's necessary. So now the politicians here are stuck with a dilemma, with an ignorancia that they created. So you have a mass of people that are uninformed, even though they got degrees, with a political problem that has converted into a real, unavoidable, for real economic problem with the bond system. With the bond system, which is happening right now. And I'm telling you, that's what before the Supreme Court. Not because they care, not because they're trying to fix anything, because no one's buying U.S. Treasury bonds. And the big cities and states operating under the United States are bankrupt. And that's what's behind it. But they're not going to tell you publicly.
That might be what's behind it. But
I'm telling you what
no,
it is.
I'm not.
Yes.
I'm not disputing that. That may be what's behind it. But what, in your opinion, in your expert opinion, should we, as the Aboriginal Indigenous people of the land, be doing?
What is universally being done
at this time? Yeah.
No,
I'm asking you what we should be doing. In case
watch what the nations are doing, and you'll recognize what we must do. It's called nationalization. They're nationalizing their resources because that's what's being damaged. Because they owe their allegiance to the people of the political jurisdictions. Now you understand how they say the time will come when the nation would have to go into their own, when every man, woman, and child must confess their own, meaning that they got to go home. That's what's being forced to. Why? Because the economic system on the planet is broken. But they're not going to admit it because they broke it. You see the point? But yet they're charged to fix it. And it was the problem that we're faced. The very politicians who's charged to fix it are the ones who broke it. But they're not going to take accountability. So they're using immigrants to blame the immigrants as if the immigrants are creating it when they created it. The immigrants didn't come here because they just came here. They politically were brought here. They brought them on buses and planes for political purposes with their infighting. Now the chickens have come home to roost, as Malcolm used to say.
Wasn't at one time there was this great advertisement bringing your poor, your Hungary, whatever you're destined, whatever they were
Then
inviting folks to.
Then they have liberty. Then they use what? Then they use the Liberty in the Bay.
Yeah, the statue.
Right next to New Jersey and New York, right? And most of the Europeans here came then, not just in the early days, contrary to the misconceptions. 90% of them ain't got no nationality card, do they? They don't even have naturalization cards, but they commanded it on others. Why? Because they were taking hegemony operations under the doctrine of discovery. That's the complexity of this thing. I'm naming the systems. Now, when we talk systems, I name them. This stuff is not complex. However, it has to be seriously what? Addressed in order to fix this problem. Ignore it and civilization collapses.
And we know that, we talked about this too before. We know that
economically,
things need to, it has to collapse. If we're ever going to get.
In other words, this is what's happening here.
That's happening now.
This is what's happening. In other words, it's not coming, it's here. But it's being painted as something else. This is what I'm saying to you. It's being painted as something else. But the root of the problem is the violation of the Naturalization Act to support European colonial operations on the land, pretending to be Americans and draining the resources, but alleging the sovereignty that's vested only by sanguinists, but they're exercising it by Sule, i.e. thus substitute. That's the distinction between the republic and the democracy. You see, all of it's connected. All of it's connected. But on the surface, because they don't teach geopolitics for clear social reasons, the people are usually guided by what? The Linnaeus and Blumenbach race argument, which is presented to them to create social political divisions so they can what? Project the criminality of those who are governing onto the people. And then they opened the borders and brought immigrants in to cover up that the bond system is broken, but it doesn't appear to be that on the surface. But look beneath the surface, and that's what it is. And the chickens have come home to roost. I guarantee you they're not going to make the minutes of the Supreme Court public. Because guess what? In secret, they got to argue this because that's what they created this social political monster that is economically breaking the all of the states. They call it what I forget the term that they use. They even created a term for it, where they brought the immigrants into certain states and areas, and even when they were running their fake presidential operations, they even named the different states where they brought them in, and some of the politicians would literally take them and bring
sanctuary states.
Yes, sanctuaries. That's the term they use. Is to cover up the violation of the Naturalization Act that has come home to roost for them. And all of them are responsible because they know what caused the problem. It's the violation of the Naturalization Act. And so they're accusing the immigrants of violating when actually the politicians violated. In other words, they're projecting because the consequence is now unavoidable, and everybody who's responsible by corporate descendancy are not taking accountability. That's what it is. So what do you look at? So and back to what you were saying earlier, Dr. G, the very things that we're talking about, nations are activating. So you see, why is the U.S. corporation really going into Persia? To steal their oil, aren't they? What do they go into Venezuela? To steal their oil. Piracy. Doctrine of discovery. Monroe Doctrine. And what's happening, like you say, what they're competing with each other. And that's where the argument comes from. Monroe Doctrine, you see the point?
Mhm.
Now you understand the argument between Carney and Trump, that people who don't understand what's really going on, it confuses them. Those who know the geopolitics know it's the Monroe Doctrine. They're arguing what? Resources.
But see,
resources.
They made it seem, when I was hearing the news about what Trump did to Nicolas Maduro, that I thought he was arrested. I thought somehow he was.
They paid three. This is the,
well, they
they
put $15 million bounty pretty much on his head for anybody who has information leading to his arrest, but he's still within his country.
But let's go a little further than that.
But he's still operating.
Let's go a little further than that. What is known, what's been revealed, and that's another conversation. Among the people around him, it was mainly three. $50 million, and they were set up. That's how they got in. They didn't go in there with CIA and just pick him up.
He's not picked up. That's what I'm saying.
Just in other words, people around him were paid off. And as last I heard, it's 50 million, not 15. It was 50 million, and it was three main ones. In other words, they delivered him.
Well, we didn't ever check because it says he's still within his country operating. They're still looking for him. Yeah. They're still looking to arrest him for drug trafficking. They had to create
when they
crime.
Know that the main drugs that come into the North America, United States jurisdiction, comes through Canada and Mexico. They know it's not Venezuela. See, we're talking the record.
I realize that sometimes people have.
I'm making reference to their
charges put on them in order to justify the stuff that they.
Isn't that the Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah.
Isn't that doctrine of discovery? It ain't lawful. It's color of law, jurisdiction.
Yeah.
It's called discovery. Even in legal process, they call it discovery.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. G, and I was talking to my brother yesterday. The difficulty for people to do, all of us, is to accept that the people who are governing are thoroughly corrupt. We keep trying to look at them to operate constitutionally, i.e., which means lawfully. And they keep operating under color, but yet assuming authority that's vested only through constitutional office. You see the contradiction?
Mm-hmm.
And the people won't look at that. They keep thinking because they're holding the title that they're legitimate. They're colored. This is another reason why, Dr. G, like we said, the people have to keep their head clear. That's why you go to the Department of War, the Department of War, right?
Mm-hmm.
In their own manual, right? Same years, right?
We went out of,
right?
We're back.
So not 1828, 1928, or manual, and it makes a distinction between the republic and the democracy. They're operating as a mob. That's Khazarian mafia that rules.
We call it mobocracy.
Now it's called what? It's called AIPAC and the lobby. That's the name that's used. What did we talk about last week? Last time we were together. Boston, mainly, and Brooklyn are the real operatives that run that office. Trump is a face. He's a piñata. That's neither support nor condemnation. It's telling you how things operate. We have to grow up and get over it and recognize that Santa Claus ain't real. It's disappointing. Santa Claus ain't real. The U.S. democracy is not the republic. It is an unconstitutional platform of mobocracy in operation. How do you say, you gotta own the truth before we can fix anything. Same thing with the politicians. Why is it before the Supreme Court? because it has damaged the social structure to a degree that it can no longer be ignored. Why aren't they making a public announcement about that being before the Supreme Court, Dr. G? It's damnable and more serious than the people think it is economically and politically. That's why I say, I guarantee you they ain't going to give the public the minutes.
I'm trying to, so here's the questions. Let's put on to the, they need the shirt. Okay. Can you turn on super chats? I don't know. I don't do that, y'all. Wish I could. Okay, this is an early question. Why did the bonds break? I guess that came up real earlier.
You got to understand now. This is the point. All of the corporate states and your big cities are run on the bondage system. They sell bonds, nations buy the bonds, and people buy the bonds, and they float those bonds, and then they put liens on the bonds even after the fact and fractionalize them, and that's how they've been running the system. Then they create a feedback loop, which is why all the politicians get wealthy within months or years of them being in office, because it's all corrupt. The nation stopped buying U.S. Treasury bonds. The results of them are now starting to show up. And on the surface, people wouldn't think that. They're talking about who's citizen, who's not. The politicians are talking about who's been getting the benefits and who hasn't, and what is lawfully distributed and what is not. Why? Because the resources are becoming scarce and on some levels non-available. So they can't play the game anymore because it's exposing human trafficking under contract law of the democracy order that no one's talking about. They're avoiding talking about what's really going on. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was put in place for the doctrine of discovery, human trafficking, disguised as amendments of law. All of them are color of law.
Okay.
They're not going to say that, are they? Are they? Let's be real. Are they? You wouldn't expect them to. Yeah. They're not going to admit that they're thoroughly corrupt, past and present.
I'm looking into, we're talking about nationalization of, he talked about of resources and looking,
all over the world. That's what's happening.
But I'm looking this up, and just so I could share if something anybody could do. But it basically, it says nationalization is when a nation or governing authority takes control of natural resources or industry, so they are owned collectively rather than by the
people,
by private individuals or corporations. And that he said this includes oil, gas, minerals, land, water, utilities. We really need to take over utilities.
So now you must make the distinction between the people of the land,
right,
and the corporate citizens, which are dismissible.
Right, but a group of people can't just declare. It said nationalization informally. It requires recognized authority and structure. A people must form a recognized government, nation, or governing body, or operate within an existing legal system, local, state, tribal, national. Without authority is just a demand, not enforceable. It happens through law. We talk about nationalization,
now it's common
such
law,
as legislation, constitutional provisions, executive orders in some systems.
Exactly.
These laws define what resources are being nationalized, who controls them, and how they will be managed.
So that commands distinction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That commands definition, doesn't it? Huh?
Yeah.
So it demands denotation distinguished from connotation, meaning that the beneficiaries can't be assumed. The beneficiaries must be what? Clearly identified. That goes into what is known in law as identity.
And so truly nationalized resources, the governing body must be recognized internally or internationally, have enforcement power, courts, law enforcement, military, or regulatory control. Otherwise, the declaration has no practical effect. And some real examples would be Mexico. In 1938, the Mexican oil exploration, and as Grand Sheik, you mentioned, Venezuela oil nationalized their oil in 1976. So
here you go.
Okay, I'm gonna keep with this.
No, I just want to point that out to you because that's your answer.
Yeah, but basically, the point I'm trying to make, y'all, is that we could say it. And just saying certain things doesn't make those things so.
If you don't know how it's applied.
Right. So we need to.
So application is called what? You must identify in personam jurisdiction, subject matter jurisdiction, territorial jurisdiction. That means the organic people, the subject of law, whether you're talking about land, estates, etc., hereditaments, and territorial jurisdiction, that means the aggregate land, and the political jurisdiction boundaries called nations. There you go. It must be what? Seriously taught and discussed and analyzed, or they can't fix the problem. You see, Dr. G?
Mm-hmm.
And logically, because of the doctrine of discovery, that conversation has not been had honestly.
Yeah, this is what ChatGPT said when shared this. It says, many people are taught once you declare your nationality, everything changes. But in actual civics, declaration without structure equals no jurisdiction.
So you got
no jurisdiction equals no control, and no control equals no nationalization.
Right. So you got to teach. It has to be a taught doesn't process. The same way they have to teach naturalization because there's limited rights. So naturalization has limitations. You see? This is why they have cards that describe what those limitations are. So now the Europeans who have been occupying the land are questioning the nationalization or naturalization of others that the political venue operatives let in. Why? Because they're competing for resources. You see? So in order to make the lawful argument, they got to go to what? The Naturalization Act that they modified 1870. In other words, it's an argument. You can't avoid the argument. Through their corruption, they've created social, economic, political problems that now really have to be answered. Unavoidable. Why? Because the economies of the corporate states and the big cities across the land are bankrupt. They're politically hiding it as much as they can, and they can't hide it much longer. So let's look at this, right? Look at this, Dr. G. Elon Musk and the brother that does the movies offered to pay TSA workers.
Tyler Perry.
Right? What is this argument before the corporate trustees?
All I heard is they had to give.
They're arguing between the political parties because United States Corporation Company is going bankrupt. And they're scrambling relative to who and what they can fund and what they can't fund without telling the people the truth that they're bankrupt. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the cottonwigs don't want to support Trump's argument that was done with the immigration, open borders, of bringing voters in for the cottonwigs, i.e. Democrats. And that's what that argument was for. That's why the TSA workers weren't getting paid. You need to understand all this stuff is tied together. Because what? The finance ain't there because no one's buying the bonds. You got to understand cause and effect. Because that's what's going on. But on the surface is who's who, isn't it? Seems so innocent, don't it? Just seems like it's just some political, philosophical argument. So, you know, like the middle-class European says, dangerous to be U.S. citizen. And what do some of the nations say? One of the most dangerous things to be is an ally of the United States, because when it boils down, right, over a period of time, they drain your resources and abandon you. That's what all the different so-called allies are discovering. So now that's what they're arguing right now between the Europeans and Trump administration. And it's still tied to this. It's still tied to the Monroe Doctrine. People need to understand what you're digging into, the reality of the politics. Get over it. Avoid it and you fix nothing. Don't fix it and everything collapses. Because they're going to what? They're going to be forced to do what? Not cut out a few people here and there that have government jobs. They're going to be forced to cut out departments, period. Because they can't fund them. They're not going to say that. They're going to argue between the parties for funding that ain't going to happen. Because no one's buying the bonds. Do the research. The nations, and this is just this past week, nations reject buying U.S. Treasury bonds. They presented, and they always had buyers.
Nobody did.
They didn't sell one. So what do you think is coming before this year's out?
More shutdowns. more.
This thing, they're getting ready to get desperate. That's why they do. So, you know,
Be careful.
People,
You're expendable.
You know, as we talked before, Dr. G, people were worried about Epstein files, and they're worried about who were grabbing other people's corbacules, and it really ain't about that. The real deal of it is part of it is when they discover that union of one entity of Israel owned the United States Corporation Company, and they're really one entity. And for the people to find out that all the property taxes that have been stolen from the people since 1917 was stolen to fund Israel, and they've been robbing the equity of your homes. Epstein files. It ain't what you think it is.
It's a honey.
It ain't what
it's
you
a honey
think
trap
it is.
to get the cooperation of people.
So that's what they get you arguing.
Yeah.
Who was grabbing whose carbocules? Oh, he was caressing her garbancules. They rubbed against her keistors. Yeah, please. It seems so, that's damnable. And it's so, you know, like I said before, Dr. G, the person, the man, Epstein is a choir boy. Compared to what's really behind it is only a poster. What's behind it is ugly, and it's all of them. And it goes beyond the rituals of would you see the priesthood. You know, they got the Mogan David wine and crackers and talking about this is the blood, this is the body. When they find out all that stuff is real, and where all the missing children been going over these years, and the fact that Israel really runs not because they paid them off. Well, you understand even why you start doing what? Censoring, allegedly. Why you even have to do the fact that you have to even do that is part of the proof of what's going on. That is run by a criminal mob.
But we want to get the people to a place, we want to, and ourselves and you to a place where you can say, not just that I declared my nationality, so now it's mine, because it doesn't work necessarily like that. But get to a place where you say, I understand the system, and so that I can move strategically, within it and beyond it. And that's how we get. I feel we get to that place where we're trying to get to, where
we must.
We have to
honestly,
system. We have to understand that system.
We must honestly and seriously counter the ignorantia,
which is, I have up here, come be part of the four. We know everybody can't come, but come be part of our fourth Friday in-person civics classes at the House of Real Awakening Minds. A lot of things that we can't or don't move to say here for sake of keeping.
So you can see that constitutional free speech don't exist.
It don't exist, but
it doesn't, which is why we got to say allegedly.
Which means, but it does exist in person. And I want to thank those in private for those who come. Who last Friday was our the return of our fourth Friday civics class. We
had teaching Jay,
Lady Jay, Grand Sheik, myself, and all of those who came from far and near. And I was happy because there actually were 3 people there from Delaware. I was like, we don't get local folks.
Usually people from around the country.
I mean, California, UK,
and Canada,
Florida. But I was like, you
local people.
You came from here.
You know what, Dr. G?
Yeah.
And this is back to what I said before, because things are getting real. The adults are discovering that the political Santa Claus is not real, and we're going through the mentality of the trauma of the purging to leave the fake world behind. But we're clinging to it at the same time. It's hard. People always say, let Rome go until you have to let Rome go, until you discover that Rome dropped you any daggone way.
Yeah.
They ain't buying the bonds. Look up. Japan dumped their bonds this week and see what the implications are.
Right.
And then again, understand that you wouldn't tie it to the Naturalization Act before the Supreme Court. It's connected. It is absolutely connected. So intelligence says that the people of the land and the citizens both
He's gonna beat my arm.
Are going. I apologize.
Even just back at me.
Are going to get economically beat up. To ignore it is not going away. Why? What have we been telling people? And this is the truth. They're going to be bailing in bank accounts that you thought was yours on their double ledgers as a last-ditch effort to what? Refinancialize their dead corporation. Why? Because they will injure the people before they themselves will step down. So you have to honestly start preparing yourself for a lot of economic suffering. And people who think they're secure are not secure. For real, and that's not opinion. So when you said earlier, Dr. G, what must we do? People are not going to act on what they don't know. So they don't know politically, not just informationally, not just historically, but political. That distinction must be made on who's who, because everybody loosely is making claims on the estate, and they're going to have to discern who's who. And now you understand what's going on around the world. And what another term is used for it now around the world is called decolonization. What does decolonization mean in the real political forum? It means the nations, plural, are nationalizing their resources, which means they're making the distinction between the just sanguineous citizens or nationals, distinguished from the corporate citizens who happen to be visiting there but are not indigenous, which means they're not people of the land. Hard knock, but that's what the world is faced with right now. So politically, they must address the Naturalization Act of 1870. They can't get around it because that's the corruption of it is the source of the economic problem today. But people don't know civics, wouldn't make the connection. But politically, when you got to really solve the problem, you got to deal with the actual engineering. You can't go by emotions or, political emotional party games that they play for the general public, because that don't roll. So the just sanguinis and just soleil distinctions are what's before the nations, period. And at North America, now it's before the Supreme Court without them announcing it. How's that?
Yeah. Well,
because really it is. Because they're not going to say it. Then you understand why, just like here, why that BRICS issue is presented. Why? The nations are nationalizing their resources. Another way of putting it, how you say, not so modestly, is they're decolonizing. That's what's going on. And guess what? It's a lot of political trauma and intrigue that's going on, that's going to go on. So you have to be prepared for it. And being emotional is not going to save you or help you. You have to have intelligent people that actually have to make reasonable and intelligent decisions. Why? Because economically, the fiat systems, period, are what? Collapsing. Rather than tell you that, they'll just say, they'll use the term de-dollarization rather than tell you that the counterfeit is being discarded. And if you don't have real tie to the real resources, you're probably going to starve. They're not going to say it. But we're telling you what's really being placed before the nations.
Right. Well, we are about at that time. But again, I want to stress, like I said, we're doing one live and on the first Friday and a live in person, live stream on first Friday and live in person at House of Real Awakening Minds on the fourth Friday. And we invite you to come out.
Because it's going to have to be done because these things really have to be addressed, Dr. G.
Right.
And because the keys of civilization is in the hands of the Asiatic nation.
Absolutely.
And we're going to have to take accountability and responsibility. And we can't keep projecting arguments on an emotional level. We actually have to start really, literally, honestly teaching civics. Not talking about it, actually teaching civics.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna. I'm gonna see about getting that T-shirt available.
Well, it's sort of like it's like this, Dr. G. Whether we like it or not, it's going to be dumped in our lap, whether we like it or not. Because it is, and that's what's before us right now. And I would suggest for those of you who do a little bit of political science, try to get the minutes to the Supreme Court in this argument that's being presented before them that Dr. G mentioned earlier. Because I suggest to you that the politicians are not going to voluntarily share it with you because they're really dealing with the Naturalization Act. I'm telling you, that's what they're dealing with. Without even having any notes, because I already know the source of the problem. It's just that it's coming home to roost. And logically, because it hasn't been a subject matter among the people, right now they don't take it serious. But they will take it serious when they start losing their homes and they start, when all of a sudden, overnight, none of their credit cards work. And whatever you don't have under the mattress, you don't have.
That's right. I mean, we promoted.
No, I'm just saying
we promoted the silver. I did it starting in 2020, and people jumped on it, and when it would they were getting it when the getting was good. Then they dropped out while it was still good, and now it's almost out of reach.
We're talking about what the people yes, and course wise, and we're talking. We're not trying to create alarm, but not to tell you the truth is irresponsible. Because the people are in social, political, and economic danger by the hands of the people who have been de facto operating here, claiming authority that they do not have. They're injuring people's lives for real. And not to tell you the truth is irresponsible.
Before we go, I just want to address one thing from your perspective. You've been saying this, and even the prophet said it, that the European was going to stay here long enough to
teach you
government. What in terms of the amount of Europeans that are telling the truth, because of course they're feeling it. They're
one
feeling
of the
squeeze
few.
too.
One of the few interjection. One of the few that's telling some of the truth about the real politics here is Anna von Rees, as an example. And I'm not, saying pro or con. I'm just telling you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to deal with the truth, deal with the truth,
right?
No matter who it comes from.
That's what I'm.
Do you understand? Don't get caught in these schism games. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and because the people need knowledge, they don't need emotional bias. Who will club you in, what color your skin? That game. That's Linnaeus mind control systems. However, at the same time, you must understand when governments and nations nationalize, they're dealing with the clear distinction between people of the land, which are called nationals, and people who may be under jurisdictional, conditional, alien, subject conditions, which is called the Naturalization Act. Because resources are in place to do what? Support the populace. When the nation's economics either breaks or collapses or gets scarce, universally, they nationalize the resources. Politically, it's called nationalization. People who have been under colonial occupation, one of the strategies for stealing the resources is called denationalization. It occurred at North America and some parts of South America, which those denationalization processes is called, as an example, the Negro Act, the Trading with the Enemy Act, the establishment of the Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. All of them are denationalization actions exercised by Europeans in order to claim jurisdiction over people and lands indigenous to the land. But they appear innocent and they appear to be in place to support the people when actually they're artificial jurisdictions created for colonial theft of resources and of people. It's called what? Capital. Get over it. Grow up. Santa Claus is not real. Neither is the United States Corporation Company a country. It's a private corporation run from Davos, Switzerland, operating on the land for the purposes of extracting the resources with the intention of draining the resources, then dropping the people, which is what's been happening. Are we clear? The muddying of the issue with immigration was to cover up their criminality so they could use the immigrants as a pawn, pretending to the masses that the people or immigrants are creating the problem when it's not true. The politicians did it. In other words, they created a scapegoat. So don't fall for it. I'm sorry for beating you up.
It's all right, y'all. Yeah. Look, he didn't beat my elbow. He didn't bang my leg. But that's what I go for. Y'all, I don't know if y'all saw him. Every time he, I'm moving like this. I probably have a bruise.
Oh, poor baby.
No, but listen, we thank you. We thank you for hanging with us, and we ask you to, like, share, share this video, subscribe if you're not subscribed, subscribe to my new channel, Dr. G Always Glitching. And I don't have it up, but I think I have Kush Day coming on with me on Tuesday. He just didn't send me everything, but check me out probably on Tuesday night. I will be back on. But Grand Sheik and I, you can see us together in person if you come to the House of Reawakening Minds for our fourth Friday. I believe it's April 24th. Doors open at 6:30.
Uncomfortable subject matters are being forced, because remember, and I want to interject this because, and this is redundant, the fact that this issue is before the Supreme Court tells you a lot. Because remember, it only becomes before the Supreme Court when all other venues were exhausted. So you know it's serious. Even though they're still de facto.
Yeah, so we talk about uncomfortable things, but also there's some really good information about living in private. Many of you have probably, thought,
now
you get to
clarity.
You get to hear from
that. It must be clear now
from
real.
the experts. And you know what? I have to say this. I'm excited. I really respect our instructors who come, because Teach and Lady J are they have folks flying in from California and different places for their 8-week course, coming regularly into the DC area, but yet they have made a vow and a commitment to come to House of Reawakening Minds and share with us on the 4 Fridays. And not only that, Teach has made a declaration to his students for anyone who needs consultation and so forth, that they must make a donation to the House of Reawakening Minds. You remember that? They must screenshot that donation, and the donation is actually our I think it's our our 40/40 is no longer going to be called 40/40, but our Palladium membership amount, which is 40 notes, and you get the consultation. With a master teacher. And the other thing that's coming up, Grand Sheik, their book that's coming out is going to be in e-form, and about living in private. I mean, all the laws, whatever, I'm going to even tell everything, and it's going to be exclusively available through House of Reawakening Minds. You're going to be able to. We're going to add it to the USB drive, or it may be separate, because it's going to be a little. It's going, the USB drive will go up because that's the only place you're going to be able to get that book, and it's going to be step by step.
The deal of it is, and this is the one of the things I want to interject, Dr. J. On a larger scale, the people are going to be apprised of the seriousness and necessity of that information, that I think over the years, a lot of people, because they hear it a little bit, would never really study it to see how important it is. It's manifesting, meaning the need now. Just like when Drew Ali said he make the European tell the truth. So this is where you see in these last 10 years or so, where a lot of Europeans are making videos telling the truth about the Republic, where they're talking about the Sara, Gesara, things like that, the restoration of the Republic, all that. Why? Because the middle class is dead, and they weren't supposed to be thrown under the bus. Well, they were thrown under the bus, and so the deal of it is, but you have to have a civic background so you can separate truth from other agendas, if you get the point.
Right.
Because remember, everybody that comes into these venues with this information don't come necessarily with the real intent to uplift the people. Some come in just for the finance.
Right.
And so they play on the people's emotions. The people are going to need knowledge. Why? Because this economic destruction is here, not coming. But the politicians are not going to tell you that. Why? Because they're responsible for having created the problem. They're not going to be accountable, so don't look for them to be, even though you may demand it.
Right.
Why? Because they're criminals. So that means you're going to have to do what? Take responsibility, but you're also going to have to what? Assist one another. So you can't assist each other with emotions. You're going to have to assist each other with knowledge.
So we thank you. And we thank you for your time, and we thank you for your attentiveness again. We appreciate each and every one of you for taking a couple hours out of your night to be with us. And with that, we're going to bid you a grand evening.
Islam, assalamu alaikum, shalom, vadimakum, bonabot.
All right. We appreciate y'all. We are about to leave this place.
This is not merely a building. It's a sanctuary of remembrance, a threshold where the veil parts, and minds once lulled to sleep begin to rise. This is the house of reawakening minds.
I entered in silence, intellect and despair, seeking refuge from illusions thick in the air. Walls lined with scrolls, lectures dense with light, where knowledge resurrects what was hidden from sight. No pulpit performance, no charismatic show, just a word in its purity, allowing the soul to grow. History unpacked with surgical precision, exposing falsehood, restoring vision. They taught me jurisdiction, the power of a name, how to stand in one's truth, free from legal games, from colonial codes to Moorish descent. I learned that ignorance is the true imprisonment. Not just a church, this is consciousness refined. I found myself inside the house of.
This is sacred ground, not just wood and stone. A haven for the seekers who once felt alone. Here the veil is lifted, the contract unwinds. In the house of reawakening minds. Truth is the altar, wisdom is the flame. Every soul remembered, every bloodline reclaimed. Time collapses and the spirit aligns. Inside the house of reawakening
We
minds.
speak of capitis, diminution, and trust law with grace, pulling veils from the statutes that distort the race. Reverend Doctor don't preach, she teaches through metaphysical keys and universal speeches. From Egypt to Amexim, maps are redrawn, and the minds of the lost are profoundly reborn. They decode etymology, undo the brands, expose how black was a corporate sleight of hand. This is reclamation through language and tone, where status is corrected and sovereigns are grown. From natural law to the astrological signs, the cosmos converge in these sacred confines. This ain't dogma, it's the science of the divine. Every lecture a seed in the garden of the
You
mind.
said know thyself but gave no guide, until I found the house where illusions died. Here the soul remembers, the contract is clear. We are the heirs and the ancestors cheer. This is sacred ground, not just wood and stone. A haven for the seekers who once felt alone. Here the veil is lifted, the contract unwinds. In the house of reawakening minds. Truth is the altar, wisdom is the flame. Every soul remembered, every bloodline reclaimed. Time collapses and the spirit aligns. Inside the house of reawakening.
They don't